So like any red-blooded conspiracy theorist
with a crippling anxiety.
I love basements. It's nice and cool during the summer, quiet during the day, and it keeps you from catching a stray bullet during a drive-by. Some guys, though, take their basement game to a disturbing level. John Wayne Gacy, the clown killer, made up for the lack of a basement by cramming 26 dead boys in his crawl space. Fred and Rose West buried at least 12 victims on their property, including in the basement under a slab which Fred had poured. But let's be real, when you think of basements and serial killers, you think of a girl chained up being forcefully reminded to up her skincare routine. The iconic character of Buffalo Bill was inspired by several real-world serial killers, including Ted Bundy, Ed Gein, and lesser well-known Gary Heidnik. Gary Heidnik was a deeply disturbed serial sexual assailant, kidnapper, torturer, and murderer who dabbled in cannibalism and preyed on the most vulnerable populations in Philadelphia during the mid-1980s. Heidnik was born in Eastlake, Ohio in 1943. His mother, Ellen, had spent most of her life trying to become a martini olive, and his father, Michael, was reported to be emotionally abusive and made questionable parenting decisions. Gary was a bedwetter, and his father, Michael, would make Gary hang his piss-soaked sheets out the window for the entire neighborhood to see. So I know that one. And I know that one. What group is that for?
I pissed myself!
When Gary was around 3 years old, Michael and Ellen divorced, and Gary and his brother Terry went to stay with their mother until being placed with their father and his new wife around the age of 7. While living with his mom, Gary had suffered a pretty severe accident. He had slipped and fallen headfirst to the ground, hitting hard enough that it permanently deformed his skull. His mother had been likely too busy puking in the bushes with a blood alcohol content of yes to notice that he was unconscious for nearly an hour. Life with Michael wasn't much better, though. Between the claimed emotional abuse, which Michael denied, and social issues at school, once yelling at a girl in his class that she wasn't worthy enough to talk to him, as well as being mocked for the noticeable head deformation, Gary struggled academically, despite testing with an IQ in the 140s. Eventually, he was encouraged by Michael to attend military school, in which, surprisingly, was an environment that allowed Gary to thrive. Despite this, Gary dropped out at the age of 17, instead joining the Army. His service lasted 18 months, when he was discharged with benefits for stomach issues and a diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder. After leaving the military, he used his training to get a nursing license, and was sporadically employed as a practical nurse. That's exactly who I'd want dealing with my catheter, is the piss-soaked schizo with a malformed head. Things for Gary really took a turn after his mom died, who'd long been suffering from cancer, chose to drink muriatic acid. His brother Terry, whom he had remained close with, ended their contact after Gary had attacked him, resulting in a violent fistfight. Gary was now alone and isolated from all his family. After several suicide attempts, he came to a realization. God wanted him to have a family and start a church to spread his gospel. Gary incorporated the United Church of the Ministers of God and dubbed himself Brother Gary. Brother Gary was not a pious man, though. Despite having his own church, he was a habitual John to sex workers, and would consistently cruise the social services center to pick up dates. He had a type: lean, dark-skinned, and mentally impaired. Gary would have a few relationships intermixed, one of those ending with Gary spending a little time in prison. Convincing his then-girlfriend to escort him to visit her institutionalized sister, they signed her out for a day visit. As the evening wore on, Gary told his girlfriend that he would run her home, and then return her sister to the facility in the morning. The next morning, she never arrived. After searching the logs, staff and police showed up at Heidnik's house. When searched, they found the terrified and confused woman in the corner of a pitch-dark room in the basement. She had been assaulted, and Gary was charged and sentenced to 8 years for the kidnapping and assault, but served only 3. She had become pregnant by Gary, but because of her diminished mental state, the child was put into the Department of Family Services. Going into the 1980s, Philadelphia grappled with the harsh reality of poverty. Rows of rundown houses and shuttered businesses reflected economic struggles, casting a shadow over the city. Mental health services, along with their stigma, were underfunded and struggled to address the growing need for support for the intellectually disabled. Access to resources like education, healthcare was uneven and strained. The era exposed the harsh truth of neglected mental health and limited assistance for the intellectually disabled, setting the stage for exploitation of this underserved community. And Gary did exploit, especially the parishioners of his church, which many of whom were part of this population. He was able to convince them in prosperity gospel-style sermons to sign over their wealth to the church, which in turn made its way into Gary's pocket, which he turned into a small fortune on the stock market. During this time, Gary had briefly married to a Filipino woman who he abused and humiliated by forcing her to participate in group sex with sex workers or his service center pickups. She escaped Gary unbeknownst to him, carrying his child, which infuriated him and made him vow to never be denied a child. Beginning in November 1986, Gary Heidnik abducted 6 women. The captives were sexually abused, tortured, chained to a pipe in the basement, or forced to be in a hole that Gary had dug in the ground. Because of the absolute levels of abuse and torture Gary would submit these women to, one of them died due to a combination of starvation, extreme torture, and an unchecked fever. Gary now had a problem on his hands. How to deal with this? His decision, which is somewhat debated but generally accepted, is that he had dismembered the woman, grinding the flesh in a meat processor and mixing it with dog food and feeding it to the other captives. He had a problem with the arms and legs, though, placing them in a garbage bag in the freezer, marking them as dog food. Her head, he boiled on the stove. Gary ended up expanding his pit to 4 feet deep and wide enough to fit all 6 women. At night, he would force them into the hole, still chained, placing plywood over the top and heavy weights to prevent them from escaping. The women were subjected to nearly daily sexual assaults. Gary had told them that they were breeding stock. One of Gary's first victims, Josefina Rivera, was able to manipulate Gary to the best of her ability. She ended up earning certain privileges with Gary, including being able to wander the upstairs, even sleep in the bed at night at times. This allowed Josefina, on March 24, 1987, to be able to escape Gary Heidnik and contact authorities. When Gary was arrested, he told investigators something absolutely bizarre. He tried to claim that the women were already there when he moved into the house. When I bought my house, there was a fridge I had to get rid of, and that was a pain in the ass. If I looked at a house and there were 6 women chained in the basement, I probably would have passed. Throughout his trial, Gary had tried to blame the victims of his crimes for the crimes themselves, saying that they were there willingly, and the 2 women that had died in captivity had been killed by other captives. In 1988, Gary was ultimately found guilty on 2 counts of murder, and because of the severity of his crime, he was sentenced to death. On July 6, 1999, Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection. The lasting legacy of Gary Heidnik has resonated through the realms of horror and true crime, and he remains one of the most disgusting monsters that have ever existed to this day. So I'd love to know what you think down in the comments. Please remember to like, smack around that subscribe button, and click it right in the bells. And until next time, toodaloo.